The night Emily Parker first heard the whispers, she thought she was imagining them. That was the thing about Ravenwood, a small, fog-choked town in upstate New York. It had a way of making shadows feel alive, like the mist itself was watching. Emily had just turned 23, freshly graduated, and trying to start her life in the city. But after losing her parents in a car accident the year before, she had nowhere else to go. Her only living relative, her estranged uncle, Robert Hargrove, reluctantly offered her a place in his family's sprawling estate on the outskirts of town, Ravenwood Mansion. The house had been in the Hargrove family for generations, a looming Victorian structure that had somehow survived decades of decay. Its windows stared down at her like unblinking eyes, and the gates creaked with every gust of wind, warning her to stay away. Emily didn't believe in ghosts, or, at least, she didn't think she did until she stepped through the threshold. That first night, the air inside smelled of damp wood and something sour she couldn't name. Dust swirled in the moonlight that spilled through cracked stained glass. Her uncle had left her in a guest room on the second floor, a room she would later come to dread entering at night. The whispers began around midnight, faint at first, like the rustling of the trees outside. Emily froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She thought it might be the wind rattling the windows. But then she heard it, clearly, a soft, agonized voice calling her name. "Emily, help me." She jumped to her feet, looking around the room. The tall canopy bed, the dresser, the cracked mirror, all empty. Her uncle's words echoed in her mind. Some parts of the house are unpredictable. Unpredictable, that was one word for it. Over the next few nights, the whispers returned, growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, curling around her ears, dragging her toward rooms she had never entered. One night, unable to resist, she followed them to the attic. The stairs groaned under her weight. Moonlight spilled through a small, grimy window, illuminating piles of old furniture covered in white sheets. And then she saw it, a small black statue, carved in the shape of a twisted figure with hollow eyes. The whispers screamed around her now, and she felt the first real prickling of fear, the kind that burrows into your bones. She reached out to touch the statue. The moment her fingers brushed the cold stone, a wave of suffocating dread washed over her. Her lungs felt tight, her vision blurred. A scream tore from her throat, but it was swallowed by the shadows. Emily stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of boxes. They spilled open, revealing a scattering of human bones, skulls, ribs, and fragments she couldn't even identify. Blood, old and brittle, stained the floor beneath them. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt frozen in place, as if the house itself held her there. And then she saw it, a letter resting against the statue. Her trembling hands picked it up. "The one who touches me awakens the curse. Beware the shadows that follow. You are not safe." Emily's head spun. She wanted to throw the statue away, to escape, but she felt an almost magnetic pull toward it. Then the whispers became words, clear and horrible. "Emily, come to us. Join us." Her vision blackened. She collapsed. When she awoke, she was lying on the floor of her bedroom. Her uncle and cousin, Jake, hovered over her, panic etched on their faces. You were just asleep," her uncle said. "It's nothing, just a bad dream." But Emily knew it wasn't a dream. And that night, the house changed forever. Shadows moved where there should have been none. The whispers never stopped. Something was awake in Ravenwood Mansion, something waiting for her. And Emily Parker had no idea that the moment she touched the statue, her life and the mansion itself was no longer her own. Emily Parker woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The morning light was weak, barely cutting through the heavy curtains, yet the room felt colder than the night before. Her head throbbed, and her lungs still felt tight, as if the fear from last night had clung to her chest. She tried to convince herself it had all been a nightmare, Haunted houses weren't real, not in 2025. But deep down, she knew better. Something had followed her from the attic. Something alive. The air in her room felt heavy, almost suffocating. Then she heard Etta whisper, soft and unmistakable, "Emily." Her pulse spiked. She swung her gaze toward the closet. Scratches had appeared along the back wall overnight, jagged and raw, as if some unseen hand had carved words into the wood. The letters were written in what looked like dried blood. "You cannot hide from us." Emily stumbled back, heart racing. That hadn't been there yesterday. She forced herself to breathe, though panic clawed at her mind. Over the next 2 days, the mansion's presence became impossible to ignore. Doors she was certain she had locked were now wide open. Objects shifted inexplicably. Footsteps echoed just behind her, disappearing whenever she turned. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, flickering at impossible angles. Jake, her cousin, tried to reassure her. "You're imagining things," he said, though even his voice trembled. "Old mansions like this, they mess with your head. Just get some sleep." Emily knew it wasn't her imagination. Every night, the whispers returned, louder, more urgent, carrying a malice she could almost feel pressing against her skin. Unable to resist any longer, Emily climbed the stairs to the attic, drawn to the statue as if it were calling her name. The air grew thick, heavy with the stench of decay. Moonlight illuminated piles of furniture draped in white sheets. And there it was, the black statue, twisted and hollow-eyed, sitting amidst a floor scattered with human bones. Skulls, ribs, fragments she didn't want to identify. A letter lay beside it, freshly written. "The house hungers. The curse chooses. You are next." A movement in the corner made her spin. A shadow detached itself from the wall. Tall, impossibly thin, with a void for a face. Emily froze as it stretched toward her. A scream clawed up her throat, but it caught somewhere in her chest. She ran, down the attic stairs, through the hallways, the mansion seeming to twist and elongate with every step. Rooms she had never seen appeared out of nowhere, dark and filled with grotesque symbols carved into the walls. That night, her Uncle Robert vanished while checking the West Wing. At first, Emily and Jake thought he had gone for a walk, but as the hours passed with no sign of him, dread settled deep in their bones. No sound, no trace, only the faint echo of his voice calling her name. By midnight, Emily realized the mansion was alive. It watched them, trapped them, and was feeding off their fear. The shadows in the corners moved independently, twisting toward her in ways no human body could. Then she heard Jake screaming. She raced toward his voice, only to see him dragged into darkness by invisible hands. His cries twisted into something unnatural, almost monstrous, before fading into silence. The whispers swirled around her, insistent and cruel. "You belong to us now, and you will never leave." Emily fell to her knees. Escape was impossible. The mansion had chosen her. It was hungry, and it had claimed her as its next victim. Emily could barely catch her breath. The last echoes of Jake's scream still vibrated in her ears, twisting into something she didn't recognize, sound that felt less human and more wrong. The mansion had shown its teeth, and she understood now that she was trapped in a living nightmare. The next morning, Emily tried to convince herself she had imagined everything, but the house wouldn't let her pretend. The walls groaned as if sighing. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the corridors, and the whispers returned. Louder, angrier, almost chanting. She decided she needed answers. There had to be a reason why Ravenwood Mansion was alive, why it had claimed her family. If she could understand it, maybe she could survive. She found a small library tucked into a corner of the first floor, hidden behind a wall of shelves, dust-covered. Books lined the shelves, some bound in cracked leather, others in pages so brittle they threatened to crumble. She began to search. scanning for anything mentioning the Hargrove family or the mansion itself. In a forgotten journal, she discovered entries from the late 1800s. The author, one of her great-great-grandfathers, wrote of a cursed artifact brought back from a European estate. He described it as a small black statue, carved in the likeness of a dark entity, hollow-eyed and unnervingly lifelike. It watches, it waits, and those who touch it vanish or change, one passage read. The house remembers the curse, and those it chooses are bound forever to its hunger. Emily's stomach churned. The whispers weren't random. They were calling to her, testing her, marking her as the next vessel. The mansion itself seemed to respond as she read. Shadows stretched across the walls, writhing like living things. A cold draft swept through the library, extinguishing the single candle she had lit. She heard faint, scraping footsteps circling her, though no one was there. Then, from the far end of the hallway, a soft voice called, "Emily." Her heart seized. She ran toward the sound, down corridors that seemed to twist unnaturally, doors appearing and disappearing like the house itself was a maze. She reached a room she didn't recognize, a nursery, frozen in time. Toys lay scattered, covered in dust, and the walls were painted in dark, almost decaying colors. In the center, a mirror reflected her image, but not fully. Her eyes appeared hollow, darker than normal, almost bleeding shadows. Behind her in the reflection, she saw movement, a figure, tall and thin, stepping closer, its face an empty void. She spun around, nothing, but the reflection didn't lie. Emily realized with horror that the house could bend reality. It didn't just trap bodies, it twisted minds, merging the living with its dark essence. Hours passed, though she couldn't tell time. Exhaustion gnawed at her, but she refused to stop. She had to find Jake. She had to understand the curse. Descending to the basement, she found a hidden door she had never seen. Beyond it lay a small chamber, walls lined with grotesque carvings and symbols and dried blood. In the center stood the black statue, now glowing faintly, as if sensing her presence. Around it, bones arranged in a ritualistic pattern, some human, some she couldn't identify. The whispers became voices, dozens of them, overlapping, screaming, crying, laughing. "You belong to us." Emily staggered back. She wanted to run, but the floor shifted beneath her feet. The mansion was alive in a way she had never imagined. The shadows around her coalesced, forming a humanoid figure, taller than any human, its hollow eyes burning with malice. It reached for her, and Emily screamed. She realized that the only way to survive was to understand the statue, the curse, and perhaps make a choice she wasn't ready for. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Every shadow in her room moved independently, whispering threats and promises. And somewhere deep in the house, she could hear Jake again. His voice was distorted, echoing as if coming from 1,000 places at once. She clenched her fists. She didn't know how she would save him or herself, but she vowed she would try, because Ravenwood Mansion was alive, hungry, and patient. And it had only just begun. Emily could feel the mansion breathing around her. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains, every faint whisper in the darkness reminded her that she was no longer in control. Ravenwood Mansion had claimed her, and its hunger was growing. Determined to find Jake, she ventured deeper into the house than she had ever dared. Each hallway stretched unnaturally, doors appearing and disappearing, as if the mansion itself was shaping the layout to trap her. Shadows twisted at the corners of her vision, taking forms that resembled people she had loved or lost. In the library, Emily discovered more journals from her ancestors. They told a story of greed, obsession, and a curse that had spanned generations. One entry stood out. The black statue was brought from a monastery in Europe. It is bound with a spirit of vengeance. Every century it awakens, calling those of the Hargrove blood to serve it. The house feeds on their fear, twisting them until they are no longer human. Emily shivered. She realized the mansion had waited decades perhaps for her touch, and now that it had marked her, it would not stop. The whispers returned that night, louder, more urgent. They seemed to crawl along the walls, wrapping around her mind. Emily, join us. You cannot resist. She tried to block them out, but the mansion had its own way of forcing her attention. The mirrors in the hallways no longer reflected reality. In each reflection, she saw herself differently: halo eyes, pale skin, twisted features, and behind her, shadows of the figures who had disappeared before. Suddenly, a cold hand brushed against her shoulder. Emily spun around, nothing. But then she saw movement out of the corner of her eye, a figure dragging itself along the floor, elongated and grotesque, its face a void of darkness. She ran, heart hammering, all the way to the basement. There, the black statue waited. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, radiating cold energy that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Around it, bones arranged in ritualistic patterns glimmered in the moonlight streaming through a cracked window. Emily noticed something horrifying: fresh footprints around the statue, made by no human she had ever seen. The whispers became a chorus, chanting her name, filling the room with a sense of urgency and dread. Determined not to be consumed, Emily searched for a way to fight back. The journals mentioned protective rituals, symbols of light, and charms made from rare materials, but none were readily available. She realized she was alone. The mansion would not allow help from outside. As she examined the bones and the symbols, she felt an invisible force pressing down on her chest, squeezing, trying to make her submit. The shadows in the room coalesced into a humanoid form, taller than she could comprehend, its hollow eyes burning into her mind. "You cannot escape," it whispered in 1,000 voices. "The blood of the Hargrove is ours." Emily's vision blurred, and she fell to the floor. But in that moment, she remembered something from the journals. The statue could only manipulate those who feared it most. Fear was its weapon. Clenching her fists, she forced herself to stand. She would not give it the satisfaction, the figure hissed, shadows writhing, but Emily took a shaky step forward. The mansion seemed to shudder, walls creaking, the air thick, with malevolence. In the corner, a door she had never noticed creaked open, revealing a hidden passage. Her instincts told her Jake might be there or something worse. Emily swallowed her fear. She had no choice. If she didn't act, the mansion would consume her and everyone she loved. She stepped into the darkness. Emily's heart pounded in her, just as she stepped through the narrow passage. The walls were damp, covered in mold, and the faint stench of decay made her gag. The shadows moved independently here, curling and twisting as if alive. Every instinct screamed for her to turn back, but she couldn't. She had to find Jake. The passage led to a hidden chamber, one the mansion had clearly tried to conceal. The room was small, almost claustrophobic, and at its center stood a large, circular pit. The air above it shimmered with a strange darkness, as though reality itself was warping. And then she saw him. Jake was trapped in the pit, suspended in midair by invisible forces. His eyes were wide with terror, his body twisted unnaturally. Dark tendrils, shadows given shape wrapped around him, pulling him closer to the abyss. Emily screamed, "Jake!" The shadows reacted instantly, swirling toward her with malicious intent. They hissed and whispered in unison, "You cannot save him. You belong to us now." Emily knew she had no weapons, no charms, nothing to fight with, only her own courage. She clenched her fists and remembered the journal's warning. The statue, and by extension, the mansion, thrived on fear. She couldn't let it see her panic. She focused, forcing herself to remain calm. Slowly, she stepped closer to Jake, ignoring the shadows that lashed at her. The shadows shrieked and twisted, trying to bend her will, but she refused to look away. "Jake, hold on. I'm coming for you." With a surge of adrenaline, she reached into the pit and grabbed his hand. The shadows shrieked again, writhing violently, but Emily held fast, pulling him toward the edge. For a moment, it seemed impossible. The shadows were too strong, but she refused to give in. Then, as if the mansion itself had grown impatient, the statue's glow flared violently, and the shadows recoiled. Emily seized the moment, dragging Jake free from the pit. He collapsed into her arms, shaking uncontrollably. "Emily, I couldn't move," he stammered. It was inside me." She helped him to his feet, and for a moment, there was relief. But the mansion wasn't done. The walls groaned, doors slammed, and the whispers returned louder than ever. The shadows weren't gone, they were gathering, watching, waiting. Emily realized something horrifying. Freeing Jake hadn't broken the curse. It had only angered the mansion, and now it would come for them both with full force as they stumbled back through the hidden passage. Emily noticed markings on the walls, symbols identical to those in the journals. One passage stood out, written in blood. "Those who awaken the statue will be claimed by it." Her stomach turned. The mansion had chosen her long ago. Jake's presence had drawn the attention, but Emily was the target. They reached the main hall, exhausted and terrified. The mansion seemed quieter, almost patient now, as if it were planning its next move. Emily knew they couldn't stay here. They had to escape, but the mansion had already demonstrated that escape was nearly impossible. And somewhere deep within Ravenwood, the statue waited, pulsing with a dark life, ready to claim the next victim. Emily and Jake exchanged a grim glance. There was no turning back now. To survive, they would have to understand the mansion's past and confront the darkness that had haunted her family for generations. Emily and Jake barely made it back to the main hall, gasping for air, their bodies trembling from the encounter in the hidden chamber. The mansion had quieted, but the silence was heavier than the loudest scream. Emily could feel it watching, calculating, waiting. "This place, it's alive," Jake whispered, voice shaking. "It's like it knows everything we're thinking." Emily nodded. "And I think it knows why I'm here, why it called me." Determined to understand what they were truly dealing with, Emily returned to the library. She flipped through the journals with desperate hands, tracing her family's history and the mansion's terrible legacy. The black statue had been brought to America in the late 1800s by her ancestor, Nathaniel Hargrove, who had discovered it in a monastery in Eastern Europe. The journals described how the statue was believed to be a vessel for a vengeful spirit, a dark entity that fed on fear and pain. Every few decades, one entry read, "The spirit awakens. It calls those of the Hargrove blood. Those who resist perish. Those who obey are consumed." Emily shivered. The mansion wasn't just haunted, it was a living extension of the curse, a predator that had waited for her entire life. That night, the mansion tested them again. Emily awoke to the sound of footsteps running through the hallways, though no one else was awake. Shadows stretched along the walls, flickering and twisting into grotesque shapes. The whispers returned, almost shouting this time, "Emily, come to us. Your family belongs to us." She bolted out of bed and ran to Jake's room, only to find it empty. The windows were shattered from the inside, and dark tendrils of shadows snaked across the floor toward the hall. "Jake!" she screamed. From the corner, a figure emerged, tall, thin, its hollow eyes fixed on her. It moved unnaturally, gliding above the ground, and Emily felt an oppressive force pressing down on her chest. She stumbled backward, nearly falling, but forced herself to focus. Fear was its weapon, and she refused to give it the satisfaction. Emily remembered something in the journals. The mansion's power was strongest where the Hargrove blood had touched the statue. Somewhere in the mansion, there was a ritual chamber, the origin of the curse, where the first ancestor had awakened the spirit. If she could reach it, she might find a way to end this nightmare or at least by time. She ventured into the basement, deeper than before. The walls were lined with symbols and carvings she hadn't seen. Each step made the shadows shift, forming grotesque faces and figures that twisted to watch her. She found a narrow staircase leading further down, into darkness so complete that even her flashlight trembled under its own weight. At the bottom, she discovered a stone door, carved with the same symbols as the journals described. The whispers here were louder than ever, almost chanting. Emily knew she had reached the heart of the mansion. Somewhere inside, Jake might be trapped or worse, already a part of the house's malevolent will. Summoning all her courage, Emily pushed open the stone door. The room beyond was immense, filled with skulls, bones, and the black statue at its center, glowing faintly in the dim light. Shadows danced along the walls, and Emily could feel hundreds of eyes watching her. And there, in the corner of the room, she saw Jake. He was kneeling, his eyes vacant, whispering words she didn't understand, completely under the mansion's influence. The shadows around him pulsed like living tendrils, feeding off his fear, binding him to the curse. Emily's stomach turned. She realized that this was the true nature of the mansion. It didn't just feed on fear. It twisted its victims, using them to grow stronger, to trap the next generation of Hargrove blood. She had no choice. To save Jake, she would have to confront the statue and the curse directly, even if it meant risking her own life. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she stepped into the chamber. The black statue sat at the center, its hollow eyes glowing faintly, casting shadows that twisted across the walls like living things. Jake knelt in the corner, mumbling in a voice that wasn't entirely his own. The shadows around him writhed, pulsing as if alive, feeding off his fear. Her first instinct was to flee, but she knew she couldn't. The mansion had called her here. The curse had chosen her. If she ran, Jake would be lost forever, and she might not survive the mansion's wrath either. Taking a deep breath, Emily remembered the journal's words. The mansion and the statue thrived on fear. It used terror to control, to manipulate, to claim. If she could face it without fear, she might have a chance. She stepped closer, ignoring the whispers that clawed at her mind. Emily, come, join us. You cannot resist. The shadows recoiled slightly as she approached, as if sensing her determination. Her hand shook as she reached toward the statue. The air grew colder, thick with malevolent energy. The whispers escalated into screams, overlapping, almost deafening. You cannot touch it. Jake's distorted voice warned, but Emily ignored it. She placed her hand on the statue. A jolt of cold electricity shot through her body, and the shadows surged, slamming against her mind. She could see visions, horrific flashes of her ancestors, terrified, screaming, clawing at invisible forces. The mansion's hunger reached into her thoughts, probing, testing. Emily forced herself to focus. She imagined a light, pure and strong, surrounding her and Jake. She clenched her teeth, suppressing every ounce of fear. The shadows shrieked, recoiling, twisting violently, but the light in her mind held. The statue began to shake. The glow intensified, and a low, guttural roar filled the chamber. Pieces of the floor cracked and fell into darkness, but Emily stood firm, summoning every shred of courage she had. Jake's eyes flickered, and he cried out more himself now. Emily, I can fight it. Together, they pushed against the mansion's will. Shadows lashed, walls groaned, and the air vibrated with the mansion's rage. The statue trembled violently, the glow becoming blinding. Then, with a deafening crack, the statue split, shattering into pieces. The shadows screamed, twisting into the air before dissipating. Jake collapsed into Emily's arms, exhausted but free. The oppressive weight of the mansion lifted slightly, though it was clear that Ravenwood still pulsed with malevolent life. Emily looked around the chamber, the ritual bones, the carvings, The darkness, everything still radiated power, but the immediate threat had been broken. For the first time, she felt hope. But deep in the shadows, Emily sensed something still watching, waiting. The mansion wasn't destroyed. It had been wounded, resisted, but it would recover. And it would call. Again. Emily and Jake left the chamber, supporting each other, their minds scarred but alive. The mansion had tested them, and they had survived for now. Emily and Jake stumbled through the hallways, their bodies exhausted, their minds still reeling from the confrontation with the statue. The oppressive weight of Ravenwood Mansion had lifted slightly, but the house was far from done with them. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow stretching along the walls, reminded them that the mansion was alive, patient, and vengeful. They tried to retrace their steps to the main entrance, but the corridors had changed. Doors that had been there earlier were gone, replaced by walls. Staircases twisted unnaturally, leading them into rooms they didn't recognize. The mansion was reshaping itself, turning every attempt at escape into a trap. "Emily, what if we never get out?" Jake whispered, fear lacing his voice. "We have to," Emily said firmly, gripping his hand. "The mansion can't win if we don't let it." As they turned a corner, the temperature dropped sharply. Their breaths came out in clouds, and the shadows thickened, swirling around them like smoke. Faint whispers echoed through the halls. "You cannot leave. You belong to us." From the darkness, figures began to emerge, elongated, grotesque, shapes with hollow, black eyes. Some resembled previous victims, twisted and broken, their movements jerky and unnatural. Emily realized these were the souls the mansion had already claimed, now part of its army of shadows. She grabbed Jake and ran, trying to ignore the hands that reached out from the walls, trying to pull them back. Each step was agony, each turn, a fight against invisible forces. The mansion seemed determined to claim them completely. Eventually, they stumbled into the grand dining hall, once elegant but now decayed. Chandeliers hung crooked, cobwebs stretching across the ceiling, and there, at the far end, stood a massive portrait of Nathaniel Hargrove, her ancestor who had first brought the cursed statue to America. His painted eyes seemed to follow them, burning with silent malice. Beneath the portrait, a trap door appeared, slowly creaking open. From its depths, a low guttural moan echoed, resonating through the walls. Emily realized it was the source of the mansion's lingering power, a hidden chamber even more dangerous than the one they had faced before. "We have to see what's down there," Emily said, her voice trembling but determined. "It's the only way to stop this, or at least understand it." Jake hesitated, but he nodded. Together, they descended into the trap door, the darkness swallowing them whole. The air grew colder with every step, the walls seemingly closing in. Shadows flickered in the corners of their vision, forming faces that screamed silently, mouths frozen in terror. At the bottom, they entered a chamber unlike anything they had seen. Ancient symbols were carved into the stone walls, glowing faintly in a sickly green light. In the center, another black statue stood bigger, more menacing, and pulsing with power. Around it were skulls and bones, arranged in patterns that sent shivers down their spines, and theirs chained to the floor was something worse than they could have imagined. A horrifically twisted figure of Jake, his body partially consumed by shadows, eyes hollow and staring, his mouth twisted into a silent scream. Emily's heart dropped. The mansion had predicted their defiance. It had prepared this a trap to claim Jake entirely if she tried to resist. Tears streamed down her face, but she clenched her fists. Fear was the mansion's weapon. She refused to give in. "We fight," she whispered. "Together, no matter what." The shadows surged toward them, and the green glow of the statue intensified. The mansion was preparing its final strike, determined to consume them both completely. Emily's heart pounded as she stared at the twisted figure of Jake chained to the floor. The mansion had pushed him to the brink, and now the shadows were closing in, eager to finish what they had started. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but she knew that running would only make things worse. The black statue in the center pulsed with an almost living rhythm, casting the room in sickly green light. Shadows writhed and shifted, forming grotesque faces, arms, and legs. The whispers had become screams, a deafening chorus that clawed at her mind. "You cannot save him. You belong to us. Join us." Emily's hands shook, but she clenched her fists. Fear was the mansion's weapon. If she let it control her, Jake would be lost forever. She forced herself to focus, summoning every ounce of courage she had left. She remembered the journal's instructions. The statue could be weakened by direct defiance, by facing it without fear. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I will not be your victim," she shouted. The shadows surged, lashing at her with invisible force, but she stood firm. The statue pulsed violently, and cracks began to appear along its black surface. The green light flickered, and for the first time, Emily sensed that the mansion itself was vulnerable. The twisted Jake groaned, the shadows around him tightening, trying to drag him further into the abyss. Emily reached him, ignoring the shadows that clawed at her arms and legs. She placed her hands on his chest, whispering, "Fight it, Jake. Fight it with me." Something inside him stirred. The shadow screamed, twisting violently as Jake's eyes began to focus, and his body trembled. Together, they drew strength from one another, defying the mansion's will. The statue's cracks spread rapidly. Pieces of black stone shattered and fell to the ground, and the pulsing green light became erratic. The shadows writhed and shrieked, forming a vortex around them, attempting to pull them into the darkness. Emily realized that to end this, she had to destroy the source completely. She grabbed a shard of the broken statue and drove it into the center of the remaining structure. A blinding flash of light filled the chamber, accompanied by a deafening roar. The mansion shook violently. Walls cracked, shadows screamed, and the air itself seemed to warp. The cursed statue shattered into dust, and the chains binding Jake disintegrated. He collapsed into Emily's arms, coughing, gasping for air, but alive. The green light faded, and the oppressive weight that had filled the mansion for centuries lifted. The shadows dissipated, leaving only silence and stillness. Ravenwood Mansion, though battered, seemed empty. Emily and Jake slowly stood, leaning on each other for support. The journals had said the curse could awaken again, but for now, the immediate threat had ended. They had survived, and Jake was free as they walked toward the exit. The grand halls of the mansion stretched endlessly, but for the first time, Emily felt hope. The mansion had tested them, broken them, and tried to claim their very souls, but they had fought back. Yet deep in the farthest corner of the mansion, buried beneath layers of shadow and stone, a faint pulse remained. The black statue's essence lingered, dormant but alive. Ravenwood Mansion was wounded, but it was not destroyed. Emily and Jake emerged into the cool night air, gasping, their hearts still pounding. They had survived the horrors within, but the memory of the mansion, its whispers, and its hunger, would haunt them forever. Emily and Jake stumbled out of Ravenwood Mansion into the cool night air. The moon hung low over the treetops, casting pale light over the crumbling estate. They were alive, truly alive for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Jake sank to the ground, exhausted and trembling. "Emily, we did it," he whispered, voice hoarse. "We survived," Emily replied, wrapping her arms around him. But deep down, she knew that survival didn't mean the nightmare was over. Ravenwood Mansion had been wounded, but the shadows within it were patient. They could wait, and they would return. Over the next few days, Emily and Jake tried to adjust to normal life, but the mansion had left its mark. Nightmares plagued them, both visions of twisting shadows, whispering voices, and hollow eyes that watched them from the darkness. Emily discovered that every mirror reflected more than just reality. Sometimes, she could see the faint outline of the mansion's rooms, stretching into her home. One evening, as they sat together, Emily opened one of the old journals once more. She read aloud, "Ravenwood does not forget. The curse may be dormant, but it waits. Those who survive its wrath carry the shadows with them, and in time, they may awaken again." Jake shivered. "Do you think it will come back?" Emily swallowed hard. "I don't know, but I do know this: we survived it once, and we'll be ready if it tries again." Weeks later, Emily returned to the site of the mansion, determined to confront her fears and seal what remained of the darkness. Ravenwood stood silent, abandoned, its windows dark, its walls decayed. She stepped cautiously toward the front door, feeling a faint chill in the air. As she reached the threshold, she noticed something that made her blood run cold: a shard of black stone, similar to the statue, glinting in the dirt. She picked it up, heart hammering, and immediately felt a pulse beneath her fingers, faint but alive. A whisper, soft and almost playful, brushed against her mind. "Not yet, Emily, not yet." She dropped the shard and stumbled back, realizing the truth. The mansion's hunger had not ended. Ravenwood had been wounded, yes, but its darkness lingered, patient and eternal. Emily and Jake left the grounds that night, holding each other tightly, their hearts heavy but determined. They had survived the horrors of Ravenwood Mansion, faced the shadows, and weakened the curse, but some part of it would always remain. And in the quiet corners of the world, in places where fear thrives, the mansion's spirit waited, waiting for the next Hargrove, the next victim, the next moment of weakness. And somewhere, in the distant shadows, the faint echo of a hollow voice whispered, "Emily, we'll meet again."